Good evening, Western Civ 2 students. So we have gotten up to the year 1968. And that would be, as I said, a terrible year in many ways. It would see the election of 1968. I already alluded to it in one important way. Lyndon Johnson, facing an immense backlash over the Vietnam War, many Democrats, he was a Democrat, were very upset about this war by the summer of 1968. And he chose not to run for re-election. Exceedingly rare for a president not to run for the nomination of his party for re-election. It's virtually a given that the party will renominate. Even Herbert Hoover, in the middle of the Great Depression, got the nomination of the Republican Party in 1932. So the fact that Johnson feared he might lose shows how bad his situation was. Well, as I said, Eugene McCarthy, pretty much a know-nothing Vermont politician, ran for the nomination on an anti-Vietnam War ticket. Bobby Kennedy entered the lists and was doing pretty well when he won California, but then lost his life in the summer of '68. With Johnson deciding not to run, and a no-name anti-war person, senator, running the only person, and most people even knew, still in the race, the party elders gravitated around Hubert Humphrey, a Minnesota senator who had become Lyndon Johnson's vice president in 1964, when Johnson himself won election. So Vice President Hubert Humphrey would wind up being the Democratic nominee to run against former Vice President Richard Nixon of California. So that's how things were shaping up when it came time for the Democratic Convention to convene in Chicago, Illinois. But as I say, a lot of people were opposed to the war. People thought that Vice President Humphrey would not end the war. After all, he was Johnson's vice president. A lot of liberal Democrats were very upset, but especially the more progressive people beyond the Democratic Party's left wing were just outraged at this fix, as they saw it, that was going to make Humphrey the nominee of the Democrats. And they didn't like Nixon a bit, the old Cold Warrior, right, who had been Eisenhower's vice president. They weren't going to vote for him. So they were very upset, and they called for a massive left-wing rally in Grant Park in Chicago. Grant Park's a big park right in the heart of the city, right on the lake shore. And more than 100,000 protesters came to protest the Democratic convention that was going to nominate Humphrey. Well, the protest was actually pretty peaceful. But, these were left-wingers. They did say insulting things about the police. They did fly American flags upside down. They did wave North Vietnamese banners around. That's the kind of thing that went on in the late 1960s. And the Chicago Police Department responded, well, let's just say they didn't respond very well. They began to wade into these protesters and attack them with batons and beat up a lot of them. Well, later on that evening, the protesters decided to try to march past the convention, in part to protest what the police had done to them. And this time it was much worse. It's not my words. An impartial investigation was conducted later that condemned what the Chicago police had done as a police riot. That the police just lost control of themselves, all sense of discipline, turning attack dogs on people, beating protesters who were literally doing nothing but walking past, savagely with batons. It was terrible. It was a terrible melee. They fired tear gas into the protesters in large amounts, so much that it got into the hall where the Democrats were meeting, and people were weeping from tear gas inside the convention because of what was going on outside. Just yet another example of how 1968 was a chaos, a dreadful chaos. But as I say, Humphrey got the Democratic nomination. The Republican nominee in 1968 was Richard Nixon. Nixon promised what he called peace with honor in Vietnam. He was not at all clear about how he wanted to achieve this, but peace was supposed to appeal to the mass of Americans who now wanted into this war. After the Tet Offensive earlier in 68, very few people were confident we could win this war. So peace was what they wanted. But, well, like Johnson said, he didn't want to be the first American president to lose a war. Well, most Americans didn't want America to lose a war. We wanted an honorable way, in other words, a non-losing way, to get out of Vietnam without clearly being defeated. And Nixon never did lay out any kind of real plan for how this would be done. But he ran on that, and he ran on a law and order platform. Remember, I told you there were riots in the African-American neighborhoods in Los Angeles, Detroit, Newark, New Jersey, Memphis, Tennessee. Rioting in the streets. The chaos at the Democratic Convention in Chicago surely gave many people the feeling that we were looking at an America coming unglued. And he ran on a law and order ticket. Peace with honor in Vietnam, law and order at home. That was Richard Nixon, the Republican nominee's strategy. It worked. It worked. As unpopular as Lyndon Johnson was by November of 68, it's really kind of remarkable that Humphrey did as well as he did, but Nixon comfortably won election as president in 1968. Now, as it turned out, in many ways, Nixon would be a very surprising president. He had been vice president for 8 years, after 6 years as a senator and a couple of years as a congressman from California. So he was very well experienced. He had actually been out of politics. He'd run for election as governor of California in 1962, and he lost. And actually, at that time, he said he was dropping out of politics. He told the reporters, "You won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore." But he came back in 1968 and won the presidency. Now, he had been a cold warrior, right? He had been a hunter after communists. He had not been quite like Joe McCarthy, but he had been a pretty gung-ho anti-communist. And yet, as president, he will do some astonishing things relating to the Cold War. We'll get to that. He was considered a fairly conservative Republican by a lot of people. And yet, when he became president, he did some things that actually appealed to liberals very much. The Environmental Protection Agency was created under Richard Nixon. The very first affirmative action programs, government programs designed to encourage government contracts to go to companies owned by ethnic minorities and women. The very first affirmative action programs were started by Richard Nixon. Title IX was added to the Education Act to create more gender equality between male and female programs in colleges and high schools as far as funding and resources goes. These are all things that you might think was pretty liberal, but it was actually the Republican, who many people thought of as fairly conservative, Richard Nixon, who did them. But of course, the crucial thing was Vietnam. Now, in the end, the strategy that Nixon came up with was Vietnamization. The idea that we were going to hand the war over to the South Vietnamese army to fight and bring our boys home. We were supposed to be crash training them. Now, how precisely this was going to be different than what had happened before, I'm not really very sure. Because we had been there training the South Vietnamese army since the 50s, and they had not become a very effective fighting force. But somehow Nixon thinks we're going to now be able to hand things over to them. Enormous amounts of material were put in. It was under Nixon that the number of our troops reached their height. In Vietnam and the countries right around it, like the air bases around it, 500,000 American fighting personnel were in the Vietnam War theater under Nixon in the early years. Well, Nixon wanted to drive the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table. And he increased the bombing of North Vietnam by air. B-52s, those huge strategic bombers, mission after mission. The capital of Hanoi was practically flattened. Pardon me. Enormous amounts of ordnance dropped. In the course of the Vietnam War, the United States dropped more explosives on North Vietnam than we did on Germany and Japan combined in World War II. We bombed them to smithereens, and yet they would not come to the negotiating table because of this. This frustrated Nixon no end. He tried carrots, he tried sticks, and they would not come until it became clear that we were leaving. Nothing less than our getting out of Vietnam was going to satisfy them. Now, this bombing of North Vietnam was, again, not terribly popular in the United States. People wanted America out of this war. A clear majority did. And he was president for nearly 7 years, well, 6 years, before we finally got the peace. So this was by no means, I'm sorry, I misspoke there, nearly 4 years. Nearly 4 years. My apology. Nearly 4 years before the peace agreement was reached. And he kept upping the ante on the bombing. There is a narrow country named Laos immediately west of Vietnam. And the North Vietnamese had been sending supplies to South Vietnam through this long, skinny country of Laos. It's mostly jungle and mountains. And they had carved a roadway that was known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos and Cambodia. So they were running weapons to the the Southern Viet Cong rebels against the South Vietnamese government, communist rebels in the South, and moving even their own troops to fight with the Viet Cong through these two other countries. Richard Nixon bombed the Ho Chi Minh Trail, bombing countries other than Vietnam, and then finally he invaded Cambodia to try to destroy the end of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So when Americans wanting out of the war, he's bombing 2 more countries and invading one of them. So you can just imagine how this went over with a lot of anti-war protesters back home. So Nixon gets a reputation, among them at least, as being awful. And certainly a lot of North Vietnamese died. A lot of North Vietnamese civilians died because of bombing. I know that can be disputed. But you could argue that it did work. Our enormous bombardment went on so long and so heavily. Eventually, the North Vietnamese wanted secret talks in Paris. Henry Kissinger, Nixon's chief foreign policy man, went to Paris. These talks went on for months behind the scenes. The world barely knew they were happening. But in the end, a deal was reached. The deal was this. America would leave our massive amount of military equipment behind for the South Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese would pledge not to attack South Vietnam for a certain amount of time. I believe it was 2 years. And we were going to be allowed to end. Our prisoners were going to be released. That was a sticking point. American flying men had been shot down over North Vietnam and held prisoner in awful conditions in a prison camp that got the nickname Hanoi Hilton from its inmates. But that was the deal that was reached right before Election Day in 1972. Nixon would be reelected. But there's going to be one more component to his reelection I'll need to tell you about tomorrow. And then we'll talk about Watergate in the next lecture, because you need to know about that just to be an educated American, okay? But we'll wrap this lecture up now. Tomorrow, Nixon goes to China. The Cold War reaches a kind of détente, and Watergate. Thank you.